if I would ask you, what is the most often repeated verse in the Torah? It would be Vayidaber Hashem El Moshe Lemor.
Yeah.
That God spoke to Moshe saying. And here we have a verse, Vayidaber Moshe El Hashem Lemor. That Moshe spoke to Hashem. This is in chapter 27, verse 15. And this is after God informs him that he's going to pass on and not enter the land of Israel. So Moshe makes a request. Perhaps you can even call it a prayer. He says, Yifkaid Hashem Elokei HaRuchos L'chol Basar. Hashem, who is the God of the spirits of all flesh, should appoint Ish al Ha'eda, a man over the congregation. Moshe asks God to appoint his successor. Asher Yetze Lifneihem, who will go out before them. Basher Yavu Lifneihem, will come back before them. Basher Yotzieim, and will take them out. Basher Yivieim, and bring them in. V'lo siya adas Hashem katzoin asher ein lehem roeh. And let the congregation of God not be like sheep without a shepherd. So Moshe Rabbeinu asks the HaKadosh Baruch Hu to designate his replacement. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, so Hashem says to Moshe, Kach luchas Yoshua ben Nun. Take Yoshua ben Nun, your great disciple, Ish asher ruach bo, a man of spirit, v'samachtos yadcho alav, and you shall place your hand upon him. And the parsha goes on and on. How the procedure by which Yoshua is to be put in place of Moshe Rabbeinu. And there are several questions over here. Why does Moshe have to make this request? Because we know that there are laws of succession in the Torah for leaders. As we learn these from the law of the king. The Torah says that when the king passes on, his son inherits the throne. Now there's a condition. The Rambam cites this, that the successor, the son, has to be memale mokam avaisav. He has to be able to fill his father's shoes. B'chachma uv'yira, in wisdom and in fear of God. And the Rambam says the following, that if he filled his father's shoes in fear of God but not in wisdom, that's easily overcome. Melamdim so. You hire some tutors for him and you bring him up to where he should be. But if he fills his father's shoes in wisdom but not in fear of God, then nothing you can do about that, and you look for someone else. In that case, the son does not inherit the position. But there's a law of succession. So what is Moshe Rabbeinu asking God to appoint a leader? We should apply the regular law of succession. So here there's a machlokas in Chazal how to understand the parsha. In the Avos Reb Nosson, it says that Moshe Rabbeinu understood that his children did not qualify. He had two sons. But Moshe understood that his sons could not fill his shoes. And accordingly, that's why Moshe asks God to designate the replacement. Because the normal order of succession would not apply. Because, as we said, there's a condition that you have to fill your father's shoes. Moshe understood that his children could not fill his shoes. That's the Avos Reb Nosson, very straightforward. But the Medrash Rabbah, and Rashi follows the Medrash Rabbah, understands that what Moshe Rabbeinu wanted is that God should designate Moshe's children. That was his intention. Not like the Avos Reb Nosson says that Moshe understood that his children were ruled out and he wanted someone else to be appointed. In other words, what Moshe really wanted was that God should designate his children. So the question is, number one, why did Moshe have to pray for that? That would be the normal order of succession. Now, if the children weren't qualified, then why would Moshe pray for that? Seems very, very strange. There's another question over here. And this question is asked in a very, very important sefer called the Megala Amukos, asks a question that why is Moshe asking God to appoint a successor? If you go back to Parshas Baloscha, we read the story of the two prophets, Eldad and Medad, who prophesied. And according to Chazal, what was their prophecy? Moshe meis, v'Yoshua machnas. And Moshe is going to die, and Yoshua will lead the Jews into Eretz Yisrael. So it already was established that Yoshua is going to be Moshe's successor. So what is the idea of this prayer, this request? So the Megala Amukas gives an answer to his question, which will also answer the other questions. He says this, that until now, there was a single leadership position in Klal Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu was both the spiritual leader, he was the Navi, he was the one who communicated with God, he was the teacher of Torah, he also was the political leader. He was the king, he was the military leader. In other words, there was an integrated leadership until this point. At this point, Moshe Rabbeinu asks HaKadosh Baruch Hu that perhaps we can divide the roles. Let there be an Ish al Ha'eda, let there be a separate man over the congregation who will be the political and military leader. So it says the Megala Amukos that of course Moshe Rabbeinu knew that Yoshua would be his successor as the Navi and as the teacher of Torah. That Moshe Rabbeinu knew. He knew the prophecy of Eldad and Medad. He knew that in that sense Yoshua would be his successor. But Moshe Rabbeinu said, but perhaps there's still something for my children. Right? They're not going to fill my shoes in the sense of being Nevi'im or being teachers of Torah. But at least they can fill the political role. They can be the generals of the army. They can be the political leaders. So that's what Moshe Rabbeinu asked. Appoint such a person. So that's how the Megala Amukos answers his question. That Moshe knew the prophecy of Eldad and Medad. He knew that Yeshua would be Moshe's spiritual successor. What he wanted was that there should be a man who will be the Ish al Ha'eda, the man who will be the political military leader. And that could be a separate person. Now this will answer the other questions. We asked that there was no order of succession. So why did Moshe have to pray? The reason he had to pray that God should establish this new position. Because you're right. Once this position is established, Moshe doesn't have to pray that his children should fill it. The normal order of succession would allow his children to fill that position. But Moshe had to pray that this position be made, that there be a division introduced between the spiritual leadership and the political leadership. And that's the idea of this prayer, that God should appoint a person, Ish al Ha'eda, a man who will be the military leader, the political leader. And Moshe thought that even though his children weren't qualified to be the spiritual successors, but maybe they could be the political and military successors. And the truth is, if you look at the verse, that really is what Moshe is speaking about. When Moshe says, Asher yetze lifneim, v'asher yavo lifneim, Rashi says, this refers to military leadership. Asher yetze lifneim, who will lead them? Rashi makes the point that in the Jewish army, the general doesn't sit behind the headquarters and direct the troops from a distance. The Jewish military leader leads, not from behind. He leads from in front. That's Asher yetze lifneim. And when the battle is over, and we have to shift gears into a peacetime mode, it's Asher Yavo Lifneim. He comes back at their head. He goes out to battle at their head, and he comes back to peace at their head. And the Malbim explains the verses making another point, that sometimes the leader leads through inspiration. And sometimes he leads by using force. So sometimes it's Yetze Lifneim and Yavo Lifneim. He goes out at their head, in front of them, and he comes back in front of them. Meaning, there's no coercion. He doesn't force them. He leads them. And sometimes it's Vasher Yotzieim, Vasher Yivieim. And sometimes he has to take them out by force and bring them back by force. You know, the people don't want to go to war, and he forces them, he compels them. Vasher Yotzieim. Sometimes they don't want the peace. They want to remain at war. And then it's Vasher Yivieim. He brings them back. So, however it is, that's what Moshe Rabbeinu wanted. What was HaKadosh Baruch Hu's answer? HaKadosh Baruch Hu's answer was that that's not what I want. Because I don't want a divided leadership. I want this integrated leadership to continue. And therefore he says, take Yoshua. And how do you prepare Yoshua? And from this point onward, it's amazing. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't tell Moshe Rabbeinu to prepare him by instructing him in politics and in military affairs. He tells Moshe Rabbeinu how to prepare Yeshua spiritually. He says you should place your hand upon him, which is the source of smicha, which is conferring of Torah authority. That you should take some of the radiance. You know, Moshe Rabbeinu's face shone like the sun. Give some of your radiance and somehow transmit that to Yoshua. I don't know what that process is. But Chazal say that it was Mehoidcha, it was a bit of Moshe's radiance, not exactly like Moshe Rabbeinu. Yoshua was on a lower level. And therefore, while Pnei Moshe was Pnei Achama, Moshe's face shone like the sun, Yoshua's face shone like the moon. It was Mehoidcha v'lo kol hoidcha. Some of your radiance, not all of your radiance, but still, to shine like the moon is also pretty nifty. But God tells Moshe Rabbeinu to prepare Yoshua spiritually, that he should be your successor in teaching Torah, your successor in prophecy, in connection to God. Why? Because the idea of a Jewish general or a Jewish politician is not what God had in mind. Because God's ideal is that the political and military leadership of the people should be vested in that person who is the prophet, who is the teacher of Torah, who is the student of Torah. And that's what Hashem had in mind. Not to introduce this artificial division. And this is a theme, by the way, which returns when the time comes to appoint the first Jewish king, and the people come to the prophet Shmuel and demand a king. And Shmuel is very distraught. He feels it's a rejection of his leadership. So the question is, how could he be upset? There is a whole chapter in the Torah, it's later in Parsha Shoftim, which talks about the laws of appointing a king and how a king is appointed, and there are mitzvahs that pertain to a king. I mean, the Jews just wanted to implement that body of legislation. How could Shmuel be upset? The answer is that Shmuel understood that when is there a parsha of a king when there is no Navi? When there is no Navi to lead the people, when there's no direct guidance from God, so then you do the second best thing, you have a king. But if there's a Navi, if you have a leader who hears the word of God and leads in accordance with the word of God, you want to appoint a secular king? That's a rejection of the Navi. What was God's consolation to Shmuel? He said, don't feel bad. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. They're rejecting me. In other words, the desire for a human, political, military leader who is detached from prophecy and divine inspiration is not a rejection of the personality of the individual Navi. It's nothing against Shmuel as an individual, God said. It's not that if there was a different Navi, they'd be happy. It's a rejection of the very concept. They don't want to be led by God. They want to be led by a human being. Yes?
But throughout history, wasn't there a Navi in addition to a king? Like the Navi would always go to the king and give his nubuah to the king.
That's the idea. The Nevi'im later, right, were not Nevi'im in the same sense. They weren't leaders that led al pi nevuah. They were neviim that were sent as needed to rebuke, to give correctives. But the idea of leadership, running the nation, Shmuel was the last. Shmuel was the last. And the rejection of Shmuel's leadership became a self-fulfilling prophecy. From that point onward, there no longer was such a leader. People didn't want it. Yes.
Moshe's idea of dividing the leadership seems very peculiar to me, because Yeshua had already, for want of a better word, earned his spurs as a general, as a leader of men. He was clearly as qualified as anybody in the camp was to be the chief of staff, the general chief of staff and political leader, it seems to me.
Well,
he's asking for this.
He won one battle, and that battle was not a decisive victory against Amalek. Right?
It seems that isn't he referred to in other places as the person who leads?
No. No.
It's only in the battle of
This is where it begins. The only time that Yeshua fills the leadership role is in the war against Amalek. And of course is one of the Meraglim. Now, this parsha has a certain poignance for modern times. Let me first speak about it on the individual level, and we'll speak about it on the national level. We tend to think, mistakenly, that there are areas of life about which God has an opinion, and there are areas of life which are removed from the Ribono Shel Olam. He has no interest in those areas. So a person might say the following, that halacha, where is halacha relevant? Halacha is relevant when I'm dealing with an issue of one of the 613 mitzvahs. For example, one of the 613 mitzvahs is the prohibition of eating a combination of meat and milk. So I have a question whether a pat is a fleshik pat, a meat pat, or is it a milchik pat, a milk pat? And if I cook something in that pot, can I eat it with the other type, and so on and so forth? That is of interest to God. That's a question of halacha, and that's of interest to God. And therefore, that type of question, I will refer to a rabbi who knows something about halacha. But if there's a question about a life's decision, a career choice, for example, personal decision, where to live, etc. That's none of God's business. That's a personal decision. That, if I choose to seek advice, I'll ask my therapist, I'll ask my family doctor, I'll ask my friends, maybe I'll even ask my wife. And that's a personal question. The truth is, it's a mistake. It's a very serious mistake. You see, a Jew, a serious Jew, understands that whatever question he faces in life, the question is, what is the Ratzon Hashem? What does the Ribono Shel Olam want from me at this moment? And it's not only a question of a pot or a spoon. If it's a career choice, what does the Ribono Shel Olam want? If it's a question of whether to get married, to whom to get married, what is the Ratzon Hashem in this instance? What will bring me closer to the Ribono Shel Olam? What could possibly estrange me from the Ribono Shel Olam? There's nothing in life which is not a question, ultimately, of the Ratzon Hashem. Sometimes we make a determination, and we can make such determinations, that the particular choice is relatively trivial, and therefore it really won't make a difference either way. I go to the restaurant, and the question is, should I order the beef or should I order the chicken? So we could say that's a trivial choice. Why? Because my understanding of Torah leads me to the conclusion that God would like me to be happy. He doesn't want me to go out of my way to eat the thing which I won't enjoy. Probably He'd be satisfied if I enjoy my meal. And therefore the question is, what will I enjoy more, the chicken or the beef? And therefore I don't have to consult a rabbi for that. No rabbi is going to tell me, I think you'll enjoy the chicken better than the beef. Okay, I understand. But except for the most trivial questions, most serious questions that we face do impact on our relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam, and often impact on halacha itself. There is a criticism that is often made of religious people that somehow they abdicate their own responsibility by putting their lives in the hands of rabbis. Then instead of exercising their own judgment, they go to Rabbanim and to Rebbes and to Rosh Yeshiva and they ask their questions as if to say, I'm not responsible for my choices. I'm putting it in that person's hands and he will decide for me. This is a total misunderstanding of the process. Right? Let me really explain to you what the idea is. You know, the critics think that when a religious Jew goes to a rabbi and asks the question, it is in the same way that a bishop goes to the Pope. That the Pope, somehow by virtue of his position, there is a concept of papal infallibility. And when he speaks ex cathedra, when he speaks from the papal throne, his word is law. And therefore we have no responsibility. We ask him our questions, and the answer he gives us is the law. That's not the issue over here. The idea which is popularly called das Torah is not the idea of rabbinic infallibility, or even rabbinic authority. It's a much simpler idea. The idea is that ultimately the answer to all questions of value, the answers are to be found in the Torah. Chazal say, hafach ba v'hafach ba d'chulu ba. If you delve into it and you turn it over and you examine it from this side and from that side, you will discover that everything is there. All the answers are there. There is no question which has a moral dimension which the Torah does not give us instruction or guidance on. Everything is there. Now, the question is, how do you extract it? How do you mine the gold? That's a tough question. Well, the answer is, you want to speak to a person who's expert in Torah. So in the same way that if you wanted to mine gold from the earth, you would speak to a geologist. And if you had a medical question, you go to a doctor. Not because the geologist is infallible, and not because the doctor is infallible, but you maximize the likelihood of getting a correct answer if you go to a person who's expert in the field. So if you want to see what the Torah says on a subject, so you want to go to the people who are expert in Torah. Now, to become an expert in Torah is not easy. To master Torah is a life's work. So if you have people who, Baruch Hashem, have spent years and years and years and years and years delving into the Torah, and they've trained themselves in the methods of Torah analysis. And by the way, this is not as easy as it sounds. You ask yourself, what does a student of Torah do on a given day? Because it may seem that what he's focused on is a very, very narrow slice of Torah. Because he's studying a very small piece of Gemara with the commentaries of Rashi, the commentaries of Tosfos, the commentaries of the Rishonim, the commentaries of the Achronim, delving in and weighing and evaluating. So you might say, listen, he's the world's biggest expert at this point on that very, very small issue in front of him. But outside of that little area of information, what can he tell us? The answer is that it's not about what he learned that day. It's by engaging in that process day after day after day, week after week after week, month after month, year after year, he has trained himself in the manner of Torah analysis. So now when you ask him a question, first of all, on the basis of his broad knowledge, he can zero in immediately on the texts that are relevant. He will not have to Google them to find out who speaks in the subject. And when the relevant texts are put in front of him, he can understand them. He can analyze them. What is the difference in a person who really knows and a person who doesn't know? Let me just tell you a story that I once heard from my good friend, Rabbi Gottlieb. He told me a great story. That there was a fellow who was working on his PhD in physics. PhD. And he's been working on his project, his dissertation, for 2 years already. 2 years. And it's been progressing, and he's on the verge of a major breakthrough, and he reads somewhere that there's going to be a conference in his city, and many physicists are coming, and in fact there's a Nobel Prize winner who did work in a related area who's going to be there for the conference. So he emails this professor, and he says that, I understand you're coming to our city for the conference, and I'm working in a related field. I really would savor the opportunity to meet with you and tell you what I'm working on. And the fellow was very gracious, and he says, sure, my pleasure. The professors, they enjoy mentoring, up-and-coming budding scholars, and let's get together for breakfast on such and such day, and you'll tell me what you're doing. Anyway, so the day finally arrives, and he's having breakfast for this great man. They're having a nice little chit-chat. And finally, at one point, the professor says, okay, so tell me what you're doing. So the person briefly describes what he's been working on for the last 2 years, and the professor looks at him with a puzzled look, and he says, that doesn't make any sense. And he pulls out a napkin, and he writes a few equations, and he says, you see, look, it doesn't work out. 2 years of work down the drain. But what does the story show? It shows that the people that really know, really know. In other words, what this PhD candidate was working on for 2 years, the person who really knew was able to see through it in 5 seconds. What are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. You want a few equations? Here, right here. It says, when you speak to Gedolei Yisrael, and you wonder, like, what do they know that I don't know? Says, that's the answer. Right? In other words, as soon as you present the question, number one, they know immediately what is relevant, what is not relevant, what are critical factors, what aren't critical factors. They know exactly the sources that bear on this issue, and their skills of analysis are such that in a second they can tell you exactly this is the situation, this is the situation. And while we're still in a fad, they have it all figured out, and they've gone on to the next thing. It's not a question of infallibility. It's a question that if you want an answer, and you believe the answer is in Torah, so where do you go to? Who do you consult with? You consult with the biggest expert you can find. Doesn't that make sense? If you have a medical question, if you're a Jew, who do you go to? The biggest expert. Who's the biggest expert?
The guy in the other city.
The guy in the other city is the biggest expert. Now, it never happens that the biggest expert is in your city, right? Can't be. So the people from Cleveland are coming to Toronto, and people from Toronto are going to Cleveland, and so on and so forth, and the Mayo Clinic, and they're coming here. But whatever it is, there's this tendency to believe that the biggest expert is somewhere else. I don't know if that's true. But you go and you ask the person who's the biggest expert. So Baruch Hashem, we have Gedolei Torah, right, who spent decades, many of them, their use of time is so phenomenal, it's breathtaking. Now, I just came across, there was a biography published of Rav Steinberg, Zeir Tzaddik Lebracha, who was a great Talmid Chacham, who was nifter over 100 years old recently. His use of time was just unimaginable. In other words, seconds, if there were available seconds, he was using them to study. And accordingly, people said that he knew everything, just knew everything. Well, he didn't know. So if you have a question, who are you going to ask? Right? You might say, listen, this question is so trivial, I can ask this to anybody, which is true. You know, if you have a sore throat, you're not going to go to the professor of sore throats in the Mayo Clinic, right? For that, you might go to your neighborhood doctor. But if there's something serious, right, you're going to find the best man you can find and get his advice. That's what it's all about. It's not a question of infallibility. We're not putting our lives into someone else's hands. And it's not that person either. The idea is, if you believe that the answers to questions are in the Torah, then who do you consult with? You consult the person who's most expert. Yes?
Does that include, is it just moral things, or does it include answers to Parnassa, answers that are like, you know, when you go to a makubal and you get and then they tell you what, is there really a basis for that?
I think it's two different things, right? Both are true, you see. Where there is a moral dimension to the choice, then I think that the answers are there in Torah. When there's not a moral dimension, then it's not quite the same thing. But you also have to keep in mind that these people are very, very smart. They're very, very bright. And Torah does sharpen a person's mind, right? So therefore, even if it's a question of, making a business decision, etc. In other words, like, it makes a lot of sense to ask such people, right? I don't think it's quite the same thing as the other situation where there is a moral dimension to the question, but I think that if you're looking for a smart person, then you will discover that the Gedolei Yisrael are very, very smart people, and their advice is probably, very, 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 very good. I think in that case, though, I think that the genuine Gedolei would probably tell you that, this is out of my area of expertise, right? And you might want to consult with people that are expert in this area. So, to the best of my knowledge, the Gedolei Torah I encountered in my lifetime, did not answer business questions, right? They would say, this is a question that you have to ask a businessman. This is a question you have to ask a doctor, etc., etc., etc. There is a level that there are certain tzaddikim that achieve. This already is out of the scope of our current discussion, which is that the tzaddik goes there about HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mekayim, that the tzaddik decrees and HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself answers. And this is a madrega, this is a level which is beyond my understanding. But there are such tzaddikim, and there are tzaddikim that could make promises because they know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will back them up. You really have to be a very, very humble person to make a credible claim that you are on that level. A person who is tainted by the slightest bit of hubris, right, you'd always have to suspect that maybe he thinks he's on that level and really isn't. But if you see a person who is genuinely modest and humble in every aspect of his life, and yet he says that this is what you should do, and you can't imagine why in the world would he know anything about that, then you'd have to consider very strongly the possibility that he's one of those tzaddikim on that level. But I'm speaking about something which is much more basic, much more fundamental, which is the question of issues that have a moral component. Right? That is the idea of Das Torah.
It seems to me that there are very few big life-changing issues that don't have a moral component.
That's right. I think that with a little thought, we come to the conclusion that any question which is really worthy of contemplation probably does have a moral dimension to it. Again, except for the most trivial or the most technical, right? If I have a store, and the question is, should I stock this brand of merchandise or that brand of merchandise? It might not be a trivial decision in terms of the success of the enterprise, but it's a technical question. So that also might not have a moral dimension to it. But for example, right, the question as to whether I should expand the hours of my business at the cost of taking time from my family and from my spiritual pursuits, et cetera, is ultimately a moral choice. The question is, to what extent do I rely on faith? To what extent do I have to exert effort to advance my career? Right? What are the trade-offs? These are serious moral questions. Right? That's the type of question that a genuine Talmid Chacham could shed light on to a greater extent than any other type of person. Now, I think that we have to understand that on the political level, on the national level, this is the same thing. I don't want to comment on very specific things. I'm only speaking in the most broad sense. Whoever understands. Whoever doesn't understand, better that way. But, in a Jewish state, when it is a question of policy, policy always has a moral dimension. Let me give you an example. Let's say there is something which currently is permitted, and the state, to advance its own ends, wishes to criminalize that activity. There's something which, until now, has been permitted, people have been doing routinely, but somehow this interferes with the smooth running of the state. The state wishes to criminalize this activity. The consequence of this policy shift will be that people that previously were engaged in certain activities will now be imprisoned for doing them, for not doing them. Is that just a policy question? Is there not a very, very deep moral consideration over here? Does the state, legitimately, a Jewish state, have the right to criminalize activity? To deprive people of their freedom, of their civil rights, to advance the ends of the state? And what ends of the state? Are we talking about the survival of the state? Are we talking about the economy of the state? Are we talking about the social cohesion of the state? These are serious questions. Who can answer questions such as that? Who should answer questions such as that in a Jewish state? You have to understand where I'm coming from, right? I'm not a politician, right? I'm a rabbi. I'm a student of Torah. And I think in categories that politicians don't think. When I think of the ideal, I think of what the Ribono Shel Olam would want, was what he would envision for a Jewish state. And it would seem to me that what the Ribono Shel Olam would envision is that decisions such as that would be informed by the values of Torah.
Doesn't every state criminalize actions in order to keep the state running properly? Jaywalking.
Jaywalking is not a criminal offense. No one, to the best of my knowledge, is ever imprisoned for jaywalking.
Tax evasion.
Right? Tax evasion, right? Could be. But tax evasion is just a form of theft. Okay? So therefore, one might say that the criminal sanctions against tax evasion are really nothing more than an extension of the consequences for theft. But the truth is, it's sort of the same question. In other words, imprisonment, right, is not a penalty which the Torah imposes. Right? So I think this is a very serious question. Now, should a Jewish state
Prison.
have prisons? No, imprisonment, by the way, is a very, very, very recent form of punishment. It doesn't have a pedigree. If you go back 300 years, punishments were much more fitting for the crime. If you stole something with your hand was chopped off. You know, imprisonment was considered a more enlightened form of punishment. But you know, the range of offenses for which prison is applied today, you know, seems to be that in many cases it is much more harsh than the punishment should be. You know, should there be prison for victimless crimes, if such a thing exists? You know, I think there are serious questions. And however states answer these questions, you know, they answer these questions for themselves in their own ways. The question is, how should a Jewish state answer these questions? To me, it would seem that we have a Torah, everything is there, that's how it should be. But somehow we've found ourselves in a situation where what Moshe Rabbeinu thought and God refuted has come to pass. Because we have this divide. We have the secular state and we have the religious authority, and the state has declared that, listen, remain within your boundaries. These are your boundaries. You will deal with the spoons and the pots. You will deal with those issues. We will deal with the issues of state. We will decide policy. We will decide military tactics and so on and so forth. So we have this artificial division, which from the perspective of a person who's a student of Torah, is bizarre. It's only that we're used to it. We're accustomed to it. How do we become accustomed to it? We become accustomed to it because we've lived in Golus for so many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So we've been accustomed to the idea that the state is the state and religion is religion, and maybe if we're living in Golus, it's the best thing. Let there be a strict separation between church and state, between synagogue and state. Let the state do its thing, whether the state is Germany, or whether the state is France, or whether the state is the United States, or Mexico, or Poland, and leave us alone, and let us live our religious lives as we wish. And we become so accustomed to the idea that this separation is good for us, that we've come to believe that perhaps that is how it should be. Now, the amazing irony is that the great Moses Mendelssohn, I say that only part facetiously, now, in his classic book Jerusalem, he was a very strong advocate of the separation of church and state. But he said that's only as long as Jews are living in the diaspora. But in the land of Israel, in a Jewish state, of course there can't be a separation of religion and state. that went without saying. So the very philosopher who was among the first to articulate the division between religion and state understood that that's in the diaspora, that's in Golus, that's not in the land of Israel, not in a Jewish state. Question?
But in a Jewish state, even if the political leaders were to consult with rabbinic authority, which rabbinic authority would, I mean, the chief rabbi is a political appointee. I mean, who would they consult, even if they wanted to consult?
You know, again, I'm not talking about a patch on the current system. I'm not saying that you can rectify the current system. Everything will be exactly as it is, but we're going to tell Netanyahu that he has to consult with Rabbi Kanievsky before he makes a decision. That's not what I'm talking about. Because I'm not talking about even a situation that could possibly be realized in practice. You see, if we're talking about a situation where the percentage of people who are devoted to Torah is a small fraction, then, you know, a theocracy is an imposition of the will of the minority and the majority. I'm talking about the theoretical construct of what a Jewish state should be if you had a nation that was entirely devoted to Torah 100%. Will such a thing exist before the Messianic age? I think not. But we can't ignore what the ideal is, right, when we face the current reality. Now, going back to Moshe Rabbeinu, It says over here that when Moshe wanted a successor, he said to God, Elokei ruchos l'chol basar, the God who is the master of all flesh, the spirits of all flesh. So Rashi says, what is that unusual expression? He refers to God as the God of the spirits of all flesh. So Rashi points out that we need a leader who can deal with such a diverse group. Everybody has an opinion. This person has an opinion. This person has an opinion. Who can deal with such a group? We need a man who is such a person. And the only person that could identify such a person is God, who himself understands every soul. God's answer was that the only way you can have that type of unanimity is if everyone is devoted to Torah. In other words, if everyone has his own ideal, if everyone has his own creed, you're not going to have consensus. You're not going to have everybody agreeing. And there is no politician in the world that can bridge those gaps. There's no politician that can deal with everybody wherever they are on the political spectrum. So the only way to create such a consensus is if everybody buys into a common body of value, and that's Torah. And that's why the successor has to be Yeshua. Yeshua, who will be like Moshe Rabbeinu, the teacher of Torah for the entire Jewish people. Until the Messianic age, it's not going to happen. And therefore, whatever we do nowadays is, as we say, b'di'evet. It's going to be second best at best, and maybe only third best, fourth best, 10th best, 100th best. In other words, it's not going to be optimal. But we can pray. We can pray for Mashiach to come and things to be set straight. But in the meantime, we have to understand that this idea that, there is God's interests and there are political interests, this is something which is abhorrent. I think that a religious politician should understand this. But I don't expect a secular politician to understand this, right? But a religious politician, I think, should be expected to understand this, right? When he makes decisions, when he decides with whom to affiliate and what policy positions he should take, and so on and so forth, he should understand that the moral dimension is such that the answers are to be found in Torah. So if a person makes the claim and says, listen, I make my decisions, I consult with political experts and so on and so forth. Says rabbis, I speak to rabbis when I have a problem with a spoon or a pot. Right? But when it comes to the political realm, says, I don't speak to rabbis, I don't, etc. What it speaks to is to a fundamental rejection of the idea that the correct answers are to be found in Torah. If you genuinely believe that the correct answers will be found in Torah, you would want to seek the advice of people who know more Torah than you do. Right? If you don't confer with the people who have that Torah knowledge, and you say, because this is out of the scope of God's interest, I don't think there's any greater prikas oil, any greater casting off of the yoke of God's authority than that. And leave it at that. Yes, question?
I want to ask you, doesn't Israel have to behave in a pragmatic and realistic way, like facing wars and these challenges, internal and external? How is it that if they have, we say ein stom kinel anes, right? They have to work on their own accord. How is it that they can consult a rabbi as to what to do in every single movement when the rabbis are very intelligent and they know a lot of Torah, but how are they going to advise militarily and economically?
I'm not saying that the rabbi should be consulted on tactical questions, right? Listen, the President of the United States, right, should not be making tactical decisions, right? There are strategic issues and there are tactical issues. In a modern military, the civilian leadership deals with overall strategy, and the military professionals deal with tactics, right? And that division is a very, very reasonable division. Rabbis are better than politicians in knowing their own limitations, believe it or not. In other words, when the news came out that President Obama, right, was selecting the targets, right, for drone attacks, right, that was an act of hubris. Because that is something, tactics should be left to the tacticians. Now there you have the military, you have generals, joint chiefs of staff, and so on and so forth. They should make decisions like that. When the civilian leadership removes itself from the broader area of strategy and begins to deal with the more specific area of tactics, that is a mistake. And I think that smart rabbis know their limitations, right? Rosh Zecher Tzadik Levracha, right? Did not take positions on specific negotiating tactics with the Palestinians, right? He said that land for peace, in theory, is acceptable, right? Whether it should be done and how it should be done, and what should the terms of agreements be, that should be left up to the people in charge. And there's no question about that. The question is, on the broader sense, for example, just to illustrate, in a Jewish state, right, what accommodations should be made for religion? Well, let's talk about the question of whether there should be civil marriage in Israel, right? Part of the platform of Yesh Atid, which, contrary to popular belief, is not the majority party in the government. It's only one faction in the government. But its platform is to encourage civil unions, right? And they have taken the position that that civil unions does not only mean of members of opposite genders, right? It has to include same-sex civil unions. Okay, is that something that a Jewish state should condone and promote, right? The Ministry of Tourism, let's say. You think, like, what could be more benign than the Ministry of Tourism, right? Their job is to promote tourism, right? Well, what do you want to promote, right? Do you want to promote Israel, right, as the spiritual center of the world, right? Or do you want to promote Israel as the most hospitable to the gay community, right? And sure enough, the Ministry of Tourism chose the latter. Now, the truth is, to me, it seems to be a no-brainer. Forget religious issues, right? Who is traveling to Israel? If you travel often, it's almost inevitable you will find yourself within an evangelical group on the plane, right? There'll be dozens and dozens and dozens of Christians that are traveling on the plane, visiting the holy sites in Israel, and so on and so forth. And the reality is, who is going? Who's going to Israel? Religious people, whether they're Christians, whether they're Jews, they're going because this is the spiritual center of the world. Promote that. Promote that. Right? Because you have a secular leaning, therefore you feel that this is what you have to promote. So Jerusalem, the holy city of Jerusalem, has to be the gay pride, site for marches. It just seems bizarre. It would seem to me, right, that we're not talking about that rabbis should be involved in the nitty-gritty, right, of dealing with tourism, but the broad contours, right, of what a Jewish state should be. There should be some Jewishness in it, right? You talk about the Ministry of Education. Now, there are many, many things that a Ministry of Education does. But Yair Lapid himself said, how is it possible that a kid can go through the Israeli system of education and not have been exposed to a page of Gemara? such a thing cannot be. But it's more frightening than that. I mean, I've read articles that have pointed out that the average Israeli kid, by the time he finishes the educational system, doesn't know what a Siddur is. He hasn't even been taught that. How can that be? So you would hope that in a Jewish state there would be some accommodation. Somehow Jewish values would shape the contours of the country. But we have this situation which is very, 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 very tragic. In other words, there is this separation of, there's the state and there's the religion, and we have to create a Chinese wall that separates the two. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that rabbis should run the tourism or the education ministry or the Ministry of Defense or the Treasury. They tell a joke that there was once a person who wanted to build a house. And his plan was he was going to build the house based on Talmudic values. So he studied the Talmud and he delved into the Talmud and he came with the blueprint for the house. And he built the house and the house collapsed. So someone asked him, I don't understand, how did the house collapse? You built it on Talmudic values. So he says, yes, that was the question of Tosfos in his commentary. I can laugh at that joke. Because, I understand, I would not claim to be able to build a house based on Talmudic values. Right? Even if I was an expert in the entire Talmud, I wouldn't dream of building a house based on Talmudic values. Right? But what a Jewish house should look like should somehow embody Talmudic values. Right? Just to give an illustration, I once was in someone's house, a very wealthy person's house. I was a scholar in residence in a synagogue in New Jersey, just identify the state, won't go farther than that. And I was put up at the house of this very, very wealthy individual. Anyway, I used the bathroom in one of the bathrooms in the house, and there were two stacks of magazines. One stack was a stack of magazines that, let's just say, the type you would find at the checkout aisle in the supermarket. And the other stack was a stack of, Home Beautiful and so on and so forth. Anyway, so while I was there, and I have vices too, so I like to read the magazines. So I read this magazine about, the dream bathroom, right? The dream bathroom. So the dream bathroom the bathroom was as big as the palace itself, and there was a glass wall. The whole wall was glass, facing the woods and so on and so forth. So I said to myself, that's not a Jewish bathroom, right? A Jewish bathroom doesn't have a glass wall, right? There's modesty, there's Jewish values. A Jewish home doesn't look like that. But anyway, I came out of the room, and my host was waiting there for me, apologizing. Right? He said, I'm really sorry. He thought I was a big rabbi, so So I said to him, which pile are you apologizing for? so he said that pile. So I got to tell you the truth. That pile I didn't look at all. And this pile says that there were things there that were antithetical to Jewish values. The idea is, a Jewish home looks a certain way. So I'm not saying we should build houses, on Talmudic principles, right? But our homes should embody Torah principles, right? And I think that's something we have to know. It's not that religion is limited to a very, very narrow place, and everything else is, not God's business, right? A serious Jew always thinks in those terms. If we aren't able to convince our Jewish brothers and sisters of that, okay, so be it. But at least we, who ostensibly are committed, at least we should remember that, right? When we make the decisions we make, that we have to keep in mind what is the will of God in these matters. Yes, last question.
Can you comment on the earlier separation?
See, the question we're discussing is that in living our lives, right? Can we make a division between the religious areas and the secular areas, so to speak, right? But obviously, the temple service, right, requires its own functionaries, right? In other words, to serve in the temple on behalf of the entire nation, that requires people that are dedicated totally to the task. Right? So therefore, that's why there are Kohanim. Right? No one says that the Kohanim should have the time or the ability to serve as political leaders and as judges and so on and so forth. There's a certain single-mindedness you need to function as a Kohen.
But didn't Moshe embody both for a short time? For
a short time, to get things started, right? As often is the case among leaders, right? They will, for a short time, do something to set an example and set things in motion, right? But then they have to hand it over to the people who will be devoted to that wholeheartedly fully.
During the Commonwealth, though, wasn't the Melech, he was sort of more political and military, and the Kohen Gadol was...
The Ramban says there was a tragedy. The Ramban in Parshas Vayechi says that the kingdom of the Chashmonaim, which was the kingdom of Kohanim, right, was counter to the...
I'm saying just the opposite. During the before that, wasn't there this concept of the Kohen?
In the Second Temple period, the Kohen Gadol was the king, right? That was the Chashmonaim. The Ramban says that was a tragedy. That entire dynasty was wiped out. He says because they violated the command of Yaakov.
So before that, though,
in the first base of Mikdash, the kings and the priests were separate.
And
the priests were from Yehuda. And
I understand, and that's my point. The
other way. The kings from Yehuda and the priests were from Levi.
Right. That's my point. When there was a separation, then was the Kohen Gadol just...
It's different. Again, the priests who served in the temple, that is a separate role, right? I'm saying that there's no such thing as a secular political leader in our thought. A Jewish king, his mission, his life's work, is to direct the people to the national ideal of Torah. That's the idea that the king had a Sefer Torah, which he carried around with him all the time, right? Because that is what is the basis of his authority. That's what his job is to do. Okay, everyone, thank you for listening.